As we count down to the first presidential debate on Thursday night, bears repeating, none of this is normal. We have never seen a presidential debate as early in the election cycle as this one. One of the candidates is a convicted felon. And that candidate, so busy trying to reset expectations, he's accusing the current president of the United States of using performance-enhancing drugs. Now, with that disclaimer, also worth pointing out that there are definitely some trend lines moving in President Biden's favor right now. But don't take my word for it. Here's Karl Rove on Fox News over the weekend.
There's been a trend since the May 30th guilty verdict in the New York case. The movement is among independents, and they have moved in recent polls roughly 9 points towards Biden, and that's where it's coming from. And remember, 21% of independents in a survey shortly after the conviction said that they would be less likely to vote for Donald Trump as a result of the conviction.
The question now, how does Joe Biden take advantage of those trends on Thursday night? How does he make the case to millions of undecided voters watching that Donald Trump's criminality should matter to them? Biden campaign co-chair Mitch Landrieu offered this roadmap on Meet the Press just yesterday.
The fact of the matter is that the sky is blue sometimes, and Donald Trump is a convicted felon. And the American people have to sit in that for a second. The person who wants to be president has to go sit with his probation officer before he actually goes to the debate. And so it is just a fact. But it's not just to call Donald Trump a convicted felon. It goes to his behavior, and it goes to his character. Remember, he's actually filed bankruptcy 6 times. That means that he's not just a bad business guy. It means he screwed all the small people who actually relied on him for a living. And so the American people are going to see that.
Tim Miller is a former Republican strategist and host of the Bulwark podcast. Claire McCaskill is a former Democratic senator from Missouri and co-host of the MSNBC podcast, How to Win 2024. Both are MSNBC contributors, and both of them are going to be in Atlanta for the debate this week. Senator McCaskill, I want you to pick up where Mitch Landrieu left off, this question of Donald Trump's criminality, because there's some hand-wringing about whether or not President Biden was going to go after former President Trump on this question. We've now seen the Biden campaign actually release an ad that goes squarely after him on this topic. Do you think he goes after him on Thursday night?
Well, I think he'll go after him. I don't know how important it is to remind everyone that Donald Trump is a felon. I think everybody in America knows he's been convicted. The problem is there's this little calcified group of people that are believing what Trump is saying, that somehow this is not a valid conviction. I think it's more important for Joe Biden to go after Donald Trump, literally hammer and tongs. He needs to be the State of the Union, Joe Biden. He needs, I mean, what a gift he's been given, Alicia. Think about it. Donald Trump has spent the last 6 months telling everybody that Joe Biden can't walk or talk. Mm-hmm. So all Joe Biden has to do is show scrappy Joe Biden from Scranton. He doesn't respect Trump. He knows Trump lies all the time. He needs to say, shut up, man, and stop your yapping, and do all of those things to put Trump in his place and stand up to him. This is about Biden showing strength, not so much what he says.
It's funny, Tim, the senator used the term junkyard dog with me over the weekend, which I think really does sum up the President Biden we may see. At the same time that you have Joe Biden actually preparing for this debate, you have reports that Trump is not doing mock debates with anyone standing in for Biden. Instead, he is meeting with Senators J.D. Vance, Marco Rubio, Eric Schmidt. Wonder what that tells you about the performance he's planning to put on Thursday.
Well, I don't. Can you even believe what comes out of the Trump world,
Fair enough.
Alicia? You know what I mean? And so I take all of those reports of what's happening in Trump world with a grain of salt. But I do think that what we can see publicly is that Donald Trump is concerned about how this debate is being framed up as you lead into the debate. That is why he's doing all of the weird stuff about Joe Biden being on drugs. It's worth reminding everybody that he tried this exact same playbook in 2020 and in a losing debate. You just don't remember that because, time is a flat circle. These news cycles flash away. But he already tried this Joe Biden is on drugs thing. It didn't work then because Joe Biden's a teetotaler, and it's absurd. And you also see it with him. There was the example over the weekend where he started to say that it wasn't true that he called the troop suckers and losers. To me, that also shows that he's a little bit worried about the debate. He's thinking about what Joe Biden's attacks might be on him, and he's trying to take the air out of the balloon ahead of time. So I think there's a lot of evidence that Trump feels is concerned about the debate. How that manifests in his weird mind and whether he's prepping or not, I'm not sure, but I think we can see plainly that he's concerned.
Claire, I think we all accept that there is an asymmetry here in terms of the fact that we expect President Biden to actually talk about policy, to talk about his record, to talk about the things that he would want to do in a second term. We don't necessarily expect that of former President Trump. Over the weekend, I don't know if you caught this, I was able to speak with Kevin Roberts, head of the Heritage Foundation, asked him about Project 2025, basically said it was about extending Trumpism. Just to remind everyone, I know you two don't need the reminder, Project 2025, a blueprint to disassemble the administrative state, implement a Christian nationalist agenda. How does President Biden take that and pin that on Donald Trump?
Well, I think he can do it pretty simply. I mean, this campaign for Biden is all about contrast. It's competence versus chaos. It's darkness versus light. It is a felonious philanderer versus a family man. It is job creation versus saying that America sucks. I mean, this really is such a contrast, and Biden just has to keep drawing that contrast. It is protecting women's freedoms versus bragging about bringing down Roe v. Wade. There are so many things where Biden can just quickly pivot to the contrast, and it is going to be very hard for Trump to do anything but blather and lie. And as we've seen when he's debated before, he doesn't do well when he's called to task. And if the mics are not on when it's not his turn to talk, I think this could go very badly for Donald Trump. We'll see. Frankly, I'm not sure it's going to make a huge amount of difference either way how this debate goes, except I do believe that these independent voters, as they watch Donald Trump more and more on media, they're seeing how unhinged he's become with electric boats and weird stuff. I mean, he's saying really weird stuff now. I mean, stuff that makes no sense.